This is our conflict of interest training that we have moving forward. For, again, those online, we're going to ask you at the end to make sure you sign in. And those sitting in here, you're going to be filling out your blue card. We're really excited to have John Blair, the city attorney of the city of Staunton here. Mr. Blair has been a local government attorney for 15 years. He's advised a number of government entities, including boards of supervisors, city councils, school board, planning commission, regional authority, even EDAs in this space there. He's most recently served as a city attorney and interim city manager for Charlottesville, Virginia, before he joined Staunton. He's got his degrees from the University of Virginia. So with that, sir, the floor is yours.
Well, I don't usually like to do this after such a great introduction, but knowing that we've got 3 city councilors here from the Queen City of Staunton, there's always, but I had quite a drive up here. It was really, I saw something I never have seen before, and guess what I saw? Wood. All right, really bad dad joke, but I usually start off a presentation with bad jokes. So let's hop into it. But before we get into the PowerPoint, I want to offer a little scenario here that you will probably think about, and you might hear something similar to this. And that is, I want you to think about how many of you have a sibling? Okay, quite a few. And I want you to think about this. Let's say you and your brother or sister live in the same city, town, or county that you represent. And let's say your sister, she doesn't live with you anymore, obviously. She's an adult. She's got children. Your children play with her children. The cousins get together for holidays and on weekends. And your sister owns a piece of property that needs to be rezoned. And the sister fills out the application, and you're sitting there on the dais, and up comes your sister's rezoning. And you're probably thinking, well, this is the Conflict of Interest Act. That must be a conflict. But it's not. It's not, if you voted on this. And the reason I want to bring that up before we get into the meat of the presentation is the following. One thing, if you take nothing away from this presentation but this, when you get back to your locality, please ask your local government attorney the following. Are there any ordinances or rules of council that require me to vote on a matter? Now, there's no state law that's going to require you to vote on a matter. We will get into plenty of exceptions where you cannot vote on a matter legally, but there's no law in the state code that requires you to vote on a matter. However, some localities have ordinances or rules of procedure that state that if you do not have a conflict of interest, you must vote on a matter. Now, I bring this up because this came up in Staunton, and last year we amended our city code. And I'll give you, I brought up siblings for a reason when I started this talk. Former Mayor Carolyn Dole sat on the city council for a number of years, and her brother was an attorney for a legal services group. And the legal services group, the council would periodically vote on our community development block grant, and part of that grant would go to Blue Ridge Legal Services, of which her brother was an employee. Ms. Dole felt very strongly at that time that she should not have to vote on that matter, because even though her brother didn't live with her, and even though it wouldn't be a conflict of interest legally, she felt this just did not, it wasn't part of her ethical compass to vote on something concerning her brother. And Staunton had an old ordinance, and again, some of you may have this in your city code that said council members were required to vote on all matters in which they did not have a conflict of interest. So we amended the city code to reflect that if a counselor had what they perceived to be a conflict of interest, they had to state it for the minutes of the meeting and that they did not have to vote on this. I bring this up again because I understand this is the law we're talking about, but you may have ethical compasses that you might feel, gosh, I really don't want to vote on something involving a sibling. That just makes me feel really uncomfortable. So again, make sure when you get back that check your city code, check your council rules of procedure to make sure you don't have one of those rules that states if you do not have a conflict of interest per state law, you have to vote on a matter. And again, if there's nothing else you take away, do that, because I don't want any of you to be in that scenario of being up on that dais, sort of sweating with, well, this is my sister's property and I'm getting a lot of heat here, but the city code says I have to vote if I don't have a conflict of interest per state law. So with that, we'll jump in here. Again, my name's John Blair. I'm the Staunton City Attorney. On your screen, you'll see the Conflict of Interest Act, its policy, application, and construction in state law. But what I'd like to focus on with this slide is you'll see numerate 1 there, that citizen legislative members representing fully the public in the legislative process. And that's what our conflict of interest laws are really about in Virginia. The act is to make sure that the public's interest is primary in every vote that you take, and that there is not a financial interest that may affect how a counselor would vote. So today's agenda, we want to talk about some general prohibitions, gifts, contracts and transactions, your disclosure forms, penalties, and that last one, assistance and resources. That's probably where you really want to pay attention, because there are plenty of resources you can rely on if you have a question about this. Okay. So, confidential information. I said we were going to talk about general prohibitions. Well, you see up there, Virginia Code Section 2.2-3103. It's a list of, I believe, 10 things, most of which are common sense. I'm going to assume everybody knows you can't take money to vote a certain way on a matter, right? That's common sense. If you read through, you'll see a lot of common sense things, but I wanted to highlight 2 aspects of the general prohibitions that do come up, and you'll see there confidential information. Well, there's a provision. Let's say, how many of you have been in a closed session already? Okay. Quite a few, but more of you will all go into closed session at some point, and one of those exceptions may be prospective economic development client. And let's say you're in a closed meeting, and I think, did I hear Warrenton is in the house? Well, I know you all have had some Amazon questions, but you know, you're sitting there in the economic development closed meeting, confidential, and you hear from your economic development director that Amazon might want to put a data center out on Smith Road. Now, after you get out of there, do you think you can legally go down to Smith Road and buy some property that's for sale there? No. Just want to highlight that you can't use confidential information you receive as a counselor for your own economic benefit or those of your immediate family. The other prohibition here is very newsworthy and newsy, and this was added in 2015 by the General Assembly. And it says you may not use your public office to retaliate or threaten to retaliate against a person for expressing their views on a matter of public concern. A lot of lawyerese there, but let's talk about this with the example. You've got Jim, who's a residential home builder and developer, and you've got a zoning text amendment related to making industrial properties easier to develop. And Jim comes up to your council meeting and says, I oppose this. And you are like, wait a second. You are a home builder, a developer. You love economic and community development. What is going on? And you say, Jim, I'm disappointed in you. You're in favor of pro-development ordinances, and I'm going to vote against any rezoning you ask this council for. Don't say that, okay? Do not say that. You're getting close to the line here of retaliation. Probably have stepped over the line. That would be for a criminal court to decide. But where this gets really newsy is I probably have heard about Loudoun County, and there have been various issues up there with the school board, and I won't go into all of them, but you may have heard right before the Christmas holiday, the Attorney General of Virginia bought some criminal indictments. And to my knowledge, and I talked to a couple of my colleagues in local government law, it's the first criminal indictment citing this section. And apparently they're alleging, and again, purely allegations, the superintendent threatened or retaliated against a school teacher who was speaking out about a matter of public concern, and they actually have been indicted citing this section. So it's newsy. This is the first prosecution that we're aware of citing this. But again, brand new, relatively speaking, so please be aware you cannot threaten somebody or with retaliation if they're up there at a public hearing speaking about a matter of public concern. So let's talk gifts. Again, we talked about or you as a counselor, you can't take money and then vote a certain way based on somebody who gave you money. Simple enough. But let's talk about the Conflict of Interest Act and what is a gift? Well, as we know, sometimes the rule is swallowed by the exception. Here's our definition of gift. This sounds pretty reasonable. I won't read the whole thing, but effectively, discounts, money, things of monetary value, can be an in-kind, payments in advance or reimbursements of expenses, those sorts of things can be gifts. But look at how many exceptions we have to what is a gift in the Code of Virginia. And you will see, and I know I want to get you out of here on time. I highlighted a few that will come up while you're on your council. One of which is campaign contributions, so long as you follow the disclosure laws, are not gifts. Estates are not gifts. Sometimes you'll receive a plaque or trophy from a group. That's not a gift. Gifts with a value of less than $20. This is called the lunch exception. Somebody wants to take you out to lunch, make sure it's less than $20, right? But the final the final red highlight there is something you need to keep in mind, which is gifts from relatives or personal friends. And as much as I'm here to, make sure and to try to have some gravity to this situation, because again, this, like I said, literally 2 weeks ago in Loudoun County, we saw somebody indicted over the Conflict of Interest Act. It is also important that you don't feel paralyzed in your personal life as well. And, you know, if you and a friend have exchanged a Christmas gift every year for 20 years, or birthday gifts, or whatever it is, you know, and that's just your normal course of business, I don't want you to be scared. You know, some people will have this training and they might feel like, gosh, I'm not taking a gift from anybody from now on. No Christmas gifts, birthday, work, never. I don't want you to, again, feel paralyzed in your life because of this. So relatives and personal friends, 99% of the gifts most of you receive are probably from your relatives and personal friends, right? You may on occasion get a gift from somebody who's not a relative or personal friend, but it's been my experience in working with councils and boards that that's just not a very common occurrence. Most people, they lead their lives normally. The gifts they get are from their relatives or personal friends. Now, where this gets a little tricky is your friend a lobbyist? Some folks do have friends that are lobbyists or a lobbyist principal. Now, that's another topic. Now, what does that mean? Well, it's a company that hires the lobbyist or the entity that hires the lobbyist. Or is your friend or relative trying to get a contract with your local government? That's where this can get a little tricky. But again, 99.9% of the time, my wife and I, we have exchanged Christmas presents. My mother and I, we exchange Christmas presents every year. And if I were ever elected to public office, which I never will run, but if I were, we could still exchange our, book every year that my mother and I get a book for each other, for instance. And I don't want anybody to be worried that, oh my gosh, I can't take that book this year. So let's talk about gift caps. Let's say that instead of yes.
I have a nephew who's an attorney.
Sure.
Who's also a lobbyist.
Okay.
EOC.
Okay.
For casinos.
For casinos.
Now, he gives me a gift every year.
Every year. And
As long as I don't let him build a casino in Louisa County, I can continue to get my Christmas gift.
well, you can. And I also would say this. Personal friends and relatives, even if they are lobbyists or lobbyist principal, the important thing to understand is these are still exempt gifts. They don't count as long as it's the normal gift-giving process. And the state code spells this out. For instance, and this always amuses me and most of the audiences I talk to, it has a list of criteria to look at gifts from relatives and personal friends who may be a lobbyist. And one of the things you're supposed to look at is the gift written off as a tax deduction by the gift giver or the company. And quite frankly, I can tell you this, my mother and I, the books, even if she were a lobbyist, I don't think she'd write it off on her taxes. So, but again, there can be scenarios, let's say every year we give each other a gift certificate to a local restaurant, and all of a sudden I get elected to city council, and my friend is a lobbyist, and all of a sudden every year I'll use Staunton, I give my friend a gift certificate to Buyer Street Bistro. And they give me a ticket to a gift certificate to Mrs. Rouse. And every year it's about the cost of a meal, $25, $30. But all of a sudden this year, my friend's gift to me at Christmas is a $500 gift certificate. Again, the code spells this out. You have to look at personal friend and the gift itself. What are the circumstances surrounding that gift? If it's $25, $30 every year and then you get the $500 gift certificate, push it back. Even if they're a personal friend, push it back. I can't accept that.
And won the lottery that year.
If they're lobbyists, push it back, push it back. I wouldn't want any of you to get in trouble. So let's talk about those gifts that may come from somebody who's not a relative or personal friend. They are a lobbyist, a lobbyist principal, or somebody offering or who would like a contract with your agency. It's not a total prohibition on accepting gifts from a lobbyist. Now, the code has this exception, and I have to tell you about it as part of your training, but I'm gonna say this. I would counsel just stay away from gifts in general from anybody who's a lobbyist principal, or somebody trying to get a contract. You know, and I know, look, whether it's legal or not, you're probably going to be criticized in that scenario. But there's a $108 gift cap that you can accept gifts from these folks per calendar year. Now, what I will say about this is the following. You can accept up to $108, but watch out, because the general prohibitions of the Conflict of Interest Act do point to timing. I can take $108 per the gift cap from a lobbyist, but let me ask you this. If the night before the big vote on a zoning matter involving Mr. Smith's lumberyard, Mr. Smith takes you out for a $90 dinner with some drinks the night before, is that a wise idea? No, and somebody's probably going to point to the timing of it and say, this was clearly meant to influence your vote the following night. So again, there's a $108 gift cap that you can accept from a lobbyist principal, or someone trying to get a contract with your local government. But my advice to the three Stantonians here is, don't touch it. Might be legal, but don't touch it. Gift cap exceptions. One thing I did want to highlight here, we talked about personal friendship. We'll get to the COIA Council later, but you see the food, drink, and admission charges for widely attended events. Widely attended events are defined in the Code of Virginia. One time that this does come up is, do you all have chambers of commerce that are active in your localities? Okay. Sometimes you may get an invitation for their annual dinner, and that's part of what would be considered a widely attended event. It is expected that more than 25 people will attend the event. I would again encourage you, before you go to any of these free dinners, to consult with your city, town, or county attorney, just to make sure. But there is an exception for things like a Chamber of Commerce dinner, and it's a widely attended event. Contracts. Personal interest. You can't have a personal interest if you're now an elected official, elected town or city councilor. You can't have a personal interest in the contract with your agency. There are some exceptions we'll get to. Now, what is a personal interest? Because we're going to talk about this with transactions as well. It's a financial benefit or liability that accrues to you or a member of your immediate family. Now, who's your immediate family? It is your spouse and anyone who lives in the same household with you that you declare as a dependent. So the immediate family, one of the reasons I brought up earlier about the brother or sister, as long as they're not living in the same house with you and declared as a dependent, they're not part of your immediate family, so they don't count as a personal interest. But personal interest, again, is financial benefit or liability accruing to you or your immediate family, and it lists these financial interests: ownership in a business, if you own 3% or more of the business; annual income that exceeds $5,000; If you own real property that's worth more than $5,000, personal liability, the last item I underlined here on this slide, personal liability, that means a loan. You might think, conflict of interest, nobody's really paying me here. They're just going to forgive the loan. Well, no, that's not going to work either. That's covered here in the definition. Contract prohibitions. You're prohibited contract between you and the following: a contract with your governing body, a contract with a governmental agency that is part of your locality, that's subject to your ultimate control as a council, and then finally a contract with another governmental agency except a contract of employment if your council appoints a majority of the members of the agency's governing body. A lot of legalese. I'll spell out C because that's the longest here. 2012, there was an attorney general's opinion. A county board of supervisors appointed all the members of the service authority. The executive director of the service authority was elected to the board of supervisors. But his only contract was a contract of employment with the service authority, so the attorney general opined that since his only interest was the contract with the service authority, he could continue to vote on matters concerning the service authority and could continue to be employed. Contract prohibition exceptions. So, contract of employment, provided that the employment began prior to you becoming a member of council. This occurs often with the idea of a teacher serving on a governing body. Contracts for the sale of government goods or services at uniform prices available to the public. So, I know in Staunton we use gov deals and things of that nature. Sometimes we will just list a price for things, surplus property that you can buy. You're allowed to have that contract so long it's available to everybody at the public at the same price. And then finally, contracts resulting from competitive sealed bidding, provided you had no involvement in the preparation of the bid specs and your council adopts a written resolution stating your bid is in the public interest. I'll give you a real-world example of that. I won't name the city or the councilor, but I've talked to the city attorney about this. They had a surveyor on their city council. The surveyor was known. There were only 2 surveyors, really, that were doing any local business in that city. The surveyor, there was a project, and he wanted his firm to bid on that project. And this would have been the process. The entire council would have had to have adopted, majority of the council would have had to have adopted a resolution stating the bid was in the public interest. So this does pop up.
Okay, how does that work, you're in an organization, and they know this big landowner, and you go fishing or hunting with them, does that have any effect on this?
Well,
So John, we got some people
Yeah.
online there, and so if we're going to take any questions in the audience, we're just going to have them repeat that. So I'm going to hand the mic there just for a quick summary of that one.
sure.
Say what?
The folks online couldn't hear you. So.
Okay, if you're on town council or whatever, and your friend invites you to a fishing trip, the guy that's doing the fishing trip is a contractor in the same county. But he didn't specifically name you, but he named my partners on the thing. I'm just going along for the ride.
Yeah. Well, great question. I'll try to unpack that. So I think the first thing that comes to mind is, was there any value to the trip you took? When you went on that fishing trip or hunting trip, did he give you anything? But I want to, this really does relate back to what I talked about at the beginning of this presentation. Let's say he doesn't give you anything. Let's just say he says, hey, you want to come on my land and go fishing one day, right? there's probably some monetary value, there's probably some monetary value in that. I don't know what it would be, but people do go fishing, probably some, but let's say we determine it's less than $108, right? He's not your friend. He's your, I think you said you're going along for the ride. You're going to go fish for 3 or 4 hours that day. And then he pops up and he wants a contract. You don't really, we talked about the gifts. You might have to report it on your gift, but you don't have a financial interest there, right? He's not paying you. You don't have any ownership in his land. Conflict of Interest Act probably says if he just let you on his land to fish for for half a day and you just went along for the ride and caught a fish, probably not conflicted out there, but it's what I said earlier. You better watch out and make sure your city or town doesn't have an ordinance that says you have to vote on all matters that you're not conflicted out on. In Staunton, where we passed this, one of our counselors could say, you know what? I may not have a conflict of interest here based on the state law because I can report it on my gifts and I don't have any personal interest because it's not a $5,000. He's not paying me salary or anything, but I perceive this to be a conflict. I'm not voting on it.
And hang on a second, John. Before we're going to take questions here in just a couple of minutes.
Yep.
Just like the previous one, if John doesn't get through all the slides, I get in trouble.
So
we're going to run through the slides, and then we are going to come to questions. I got to make sure you get through the slides.
Gotcha. Sorry.
That's okay. I already mispronounced the name of your city multiple times. So Stantonians, I apologize.
Thank you. All right. Further exceptions to the contract prohibition. These are some that do come up. Let's say that, the exchange of real property in terms of that contract. Here's the thing. You can't be involved, but let's say out of the blue, they want to locate nothing untoward here. So legitimately, your public works director says, we need to put our recycling center on this piece of property. It's the most central location in the city. It has the best access points. We want to put it here. And if you had no involvement in that and that turned out to be your property and you're approached, we'll go through the transaction phase of this. But in terms of you being prohibited because you own the property and it's worth more than $5,000, there is an exception there. As long as you had no involvement with the transaction. Now, again, sort of as the fishing question, you might be legal, but you're probably going to get some political heat for it. Let's be perfectly honest. Spousal contract, as long as they've been employed by the city for 5 years or longer, that's another issue. That's another exception. But I want to hit the last one because this comes up more than you would think. And that's $500 or less. And this does happen more than you would ever believe, which is somebody on your town council or city council owns a restaurant. Let's say they own a restaurant in the Shenandoah Valley in a small city of about 26,000 people. And let's say that they advertise themselves as having the best ribs in Augusta County, and there's a big billboard that says that. And let's just say you've got an economic development client that might want to locate in your city, and they say, I love ribs. And let's say that your economic development director, not thinking about anything, goes to that city councilor's restaurant, and they have dinner together there and get some ribs. Legitimately, the Stantonians here know until December 31st, one of our better restaurant owners in town was on our city council and a very popular restaurant in town. That can happen. You may have somebody who owns an office supply store. Somebody in public works or the fire department needs some notepads and they walk into your store and you don't you don't know every firefighter or every public works employee in your city or town, and they buy some notepads, and one of your political opponents is like, whoa, 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 they're benefiting. That restaurant owner, that office supply owner, this is a conflict of interest. The city is paying money to them and their own council. You can hear the arguments in your head already of how this will go. There is a $500 or less exception to this, and it's really meant for things like that, where it's an inadvertent purchase of gas at a convenience store you own or ribs at a restaurant you own. Transactions. What's a transaction? We've got the definition there, but in other words, it's a matter you consider or vote upon as a counselor. You are prohibited from having a personal interest in a transaction. There are a couple of exceptions here. If you serve on a board of trustees of a not-for-profit entity and you have no personal interest related to the nonprofit entity, you can still vote on a matter. You know where that comes from? It's typically you have community action agencies. That has come up before, and you might have a member of council who serves on a board. The second exception there. It's in the code. You're sometimes appointed to serve on a regional board. Last night, our city council appointed somebody to the Central Shenandoah Planning District Commission. Probably a lot of you will make these regional board appointments. They are allowed to vote on matters involving those regional entities. So I know we're running out of time. Personal interest in a transaction. One thing I wanted to underline there, may realize a reasonably foreseeable direct or indirect benefit or detriment as a result of the action considering the transaction. Reasonable foreseeability. Is the alleged personal interest speculative, remote, or contingent on factors beyond your control? Why is this in here? Quite easy. Huge rezoning near your house. Doesn't involve your property. Isn't on your street. But everybody says, boy, that rezoning goes in, I think your assessment's going to go up. You can't vote on that. A lot of that's going to depend on how close your house is to this proposed rezoning that might result in an increase in assessments. But if it's just purely speculative and somebody's like, you've got a conflict, no. If it's, again, the Attorney General has opined, if it's speculative, if we don't feel fairly certain that you're going to get a direct benefit here, it's not a conflict of interest. But that does come up. When I was in Albemarle County, I was the Planning Commission attorney, and at that time, there was a assisted living facility going in down the road, probably a mile away from where a commissioner lived, and some folks tried to make some hay out of that. But again, it was a mile down the road. He lived in a single-family residence. This was on a fairly well-traversed road, and it would have been purely speculative to have said he would have benefited, the value of his house or property would have benefited from this. Prohibited conduct related to transactions, mandatory disqualification if the transaction has application solely to the property or business or governmental agency in which you have a personal interest. So let's say you want to rezone your own home. Can you vote on that rezoning? No. That applies solely to the property you own. And guess what? You can't participate in closed meetings that discuss the transaction, and you can't discuss the transaction with your fellow council members. That's the law. And it typically is about real estate. That's why I bring up the example, because that's probably where you're most going to hear this. Transactions that may require disqualification. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. You may participate in the following transactions in which you have that personal interest. If you're a member of a business, profession, occupation, or group of 3 or more persons, the members of which are affected by the transaction. Here's an example of that. Your city is considering a vape shop ordinance to your zoning ordinance, an amendment to your zoning ordinance that involves vape shops. You are one of 10 vape shop owners in the city. You're a member of 3 or more people, the members of which are affected by the transaction. You may participate in here, but I'm going to get to you have disclosure requirements if you choose to participate. Second here, a party to the transaction is a client of your firm if you do not personally represent or provide services to the client. Let's talk about accountants here. You're part of an accounting firm. The transaction itself is voting on awarding the audit contract. You're part of the firm. It's been selected, but you don't ever provide services to your city or town council. You may participate or you may disqualify yourself. My advice would be to disqualify yourself in that instance, but again, there is a procedure where you could participate. Finally, C, the transaction affects the public generally, even though your interests may also be affected by the transaction. I was thinking about this on the car ride up. How many of you have heard about the idea of changing your comp plan and zoning ordinance to quote-unquote upzone? Has that been a popular topic in your localities? It's bubbling up because the idea is you'll be able to have more affordable housing. Well, how does this play into that? Charlottesville, for instance, just redid its comp plan last year, and the comp plan basically calls for massive increases in the amount of housing density across the city. It's not isolated to one area or one particular neighborhood. It's a comprehensive change to their comp plan, and they're going to also vote on their zoning ordinance to increase density across the city in what's currently single-family residential. You may have somebody come up who opposes this and say, you've got a conflict of interest because it affects the property you own. Well, it affects the public generally when you're talking about a citywide comp plan upzoning your zoning ordinance, which is what Charlottesville is doing. So you don't have a conflict if it affects the public generally. So, declaration requirements. If you have a personal transaction, let's say you're that vape shop owner, but you believe you can participate fairly and objectively in this zoning text amendment, you must make the following declaration. The transaction involved, which would be the zoning ordinance text amendment, the nature of your personal interest in the transaction. I own a vape shop. You are a member of vape shop owners, of which there are 3 or more in your city, and I am able to participate in this transaction fairly, objectively, and in the public interest. Again, my advice is always be careful. Don't get close to the line. Just don't do it. Now, you can make these declarations, and it's fine. It's legal. But if there's a question in your mind about your fairness or objectivity, don't. It requires you to state you can participate in the transaction fairly, objectively, and in the public interest, not in your own. I'm sorry, I'm trying to go quickly.
Can you ask the attorney at the meeting that you have a question and to see if it's applicable at the time?
You may. Be sure you do it before you vote. That's what I would say. I've done that before in public meetings. I've had somebody pop up at the meeting and say, I didn't realize this, but I may have a conflict. And, don't hold this against your local government attorney. If that happens, if somebody on the dais says, hey, I might have a conflict of interest, the safest thing is for that local government attorney to look at the mayor and to say, we need a brief recess so that they can talk to you in private and that they can make an analysis of the situation. That probably should be a recess question. It might not be fun because it might cause you to stay there later, but more important to get it right. If you choose to participate, you must either state orally for recordation in the minutes or file a signed written declaration with your clerk or town or city manager to be kept for public viewing for 5 years, your declaration that we just went over. Also, during every meeting at which the transaction is discussed, you must orally disclose the interest, which shall be recorded in the meeting minutes. Meaning, if you're that vape shop owner and your city has a charter requirement that all zoning ordinances be read twice at 2 separate meetings, you can declare the first time and you may think that's good enough, but actually you have to, at every meeting at which the transaction is discussed, that second meeting, you must orally disclose that interest for the minutes. Statement of economic interest. How many of you have already filed these? Probably when you were running, you had to file. These are due every year, February 1st for the preceding calendar year. I point out that gifts under $50 are not reported. You will read all the instructions yourselves, but it is important to know they're due February 1st. Otherwise, we're getting here to penalties. This is the bad stuff. It's $250 civil penalty for failure to complete your statement of economic interest by February 1st. It's Class 5 felony to intentionally make a false statement on your statement of economic interest. It's Class 1 misdemeanor to otherwise knowingly violate the Conflict of Interest Act, except it's Class 3 misdemeanor to knowingly violate the disqualification and disclosure provisions for a transaction. And here's the kicker here. If a court finds you knowingly violated the act, there's a provision that you're removed from your office. Now, it's important to note these penalties are here. They're not automatic. I hope it never occurs to anybody in this room, but if there is a charge, obviously it's a criminal charge except for the civil penalty, and you would have to be tried either before a court or a jury. Does anybody remember where this is from? What show? Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Assistants. Here we are. So let's talk about this. Your commonwealths and your city or town attorney are both authorized to issue formal written advisory opinions concerning the Conflict of Interest Act. If you're requesting one of these, you must disclose all the relevant facts. A key distinction here is the Commonwealth's attorney's opinion provides you immunity from an alleged COIA violation. A city or town attorney's opinion may only be introduced as evidence you did not knowingly violate the Conflict of Interest Act. What's that really mean? It means if I go and I fully disclose all the facts to my Commonwealth's attorney and he or she says, you know what, there's no conflict of interest here, here's your written opinion signed by me. If somebody new is elected the Commonwealth's attorney and those are the exact facts, and that person says, I'm prosecuting for this, you can present the prior written opinion as long as the facts have not changed and it's a get out of jail free card. You do that with my opinion or a town attorney's opinion, you can introduce it at trial as evidence and the jury or the judge has to consider it, but it's not a get out of jail free card. It's evidence, but it's not immunity. But I want to talk to you about something else because I understand the reality of politics. In politics, sometimes You may be of a different political persuasion than your Commonwealth's attorney, and you might feel like, I can't ask them for advice. They don't like me or whatever. Well, there is also something called the Conflict of Interest and Ethics Advisory Council. And I'm actually a member of that council, and there's professional staff. And the council can provide you an informal opinion, which remains confidential and not subject to FOIA unless you invoke it for immunity. And again, as long as all the relevant facts are disclosed, an informal opinion from the council immunizes you from prosecution for a COIA violation. So again, you disclose all the facts to the Conflict of Interest Council, and they have a professional staff person who's going to answer the question. As long as you're relying on that advice, and I did want to offer you this. At our last meeting, Stuart Pateau, who is the head of that council, I talked to him about this presentation a bit. They're always going to ask you to write down the facts. So just be prepared for that. Even if you're asking for informal advice, they want the written facts in front of them before they're going to issue you this informal opinion. But again, it's anonymous, and it stays that way unless you invoke it. But it does immunize you from a conflict of interest prosecution. And that is probably your most important asset right now in terms of if you have questions, is to contact the council. So with that, I know, let's see here, right on the dot, 3:15.
That's what we like to see, John. Thank you very much. So we're going to take questions, but just like last time, if you are online, now is the time you need to put your name and email in the chat so we can get you verified. If you are in the room, it is the ticket time again. Blue tickets out, please, so we can then capture that information for you, and Kiara will be around to gather that. Again, online, putting it in the chat, here, blue tickets, please. I know we have a couple questions online, so I'm going to go back to Josie first, and then I'm going to come back into the room.
All right, so the first question we have is kind of a multi-part question. It's, what should we do if we receive a gift above the threshold? Do we report it? If so, to whom? For example, imagine someone pays your check at dinner without letting you know they're doing it, didn't have a chance to return the gift, so what's the next step?
It's a great question. There is a provision in the Code of Virginia, in the Act, and it talks about you can return the gift, or you can pay the person or donate to charity an amount equal to the gift that was provided. That does happen on occasion.
All right, the next one we have online is, my spouse was appointed by a previous council to the Regional Tourism Board, which receives a portion of the city's transit occupancy tax for funding. Does my spouse have to step down now that I'm on council because the board, or because the tourism board receives? Is this a conflict of interest?
Well, I'd probably need more facts to give you a definitive answer, but what I will say is this. The question really becomes, in terms of the spouse, does the spouse themselves receive money from that tourism board? And because remember, to invoke the Conflict of Interest Act, it requires a personal interest in the transaction. So it must meet one of those thresholds, such as the ownership, $5,000 or more in income, things of that nature.
Does the Queen City of Staunton have a separate code of ethics that all council members sign on to?
No, we do not. Now, I do know certain boards and councils do have the code of ethics. That's a little off the topic here, but I will offer this. The Code of Virginia does provide that a council or board can do You know, one of the things that I've seen with those ethical codes isn't as much about what we're talking about here as it is respect for your fellow counselors. Meaning that some of the ones that I've seen are, we will show respect to our fellow counselors on the dais when they are speaking. We will not interrupt the fellow counselors, things of that nature. But again, as I stated at the beginning, one thing we did do in Staunton was to change our ordinance so that perceived conflicts of interest a member does not have to vote upon.
So I know most of us here probably have other day jobs. What about for your employer? If you're voting on something that could benefit your employer or the business you work for?
If you're receiving a salary of $5,000 or more, you need to recuse yourself.
All right. Thank you.
How you doing?
Hey.
So I own a business, and I just got elected first time, but for years I've been providing service to the town 3 or 4 times a year. The average cost for the service is around $200 to $300 per time. So is that $500 cumulative throughout the whole year, or is it per transaction? And would I still be able to provide the vital service to the community? It's generally not a sealed bid thing. They call and ask us for a quote. So.
Right. Actually, I researched that. It's funny you asked that because I thought this question would come up. There is no Attorney General's opinion on this. I thought there would be, but I looked $500. Here's what I would offer. Again, don't get close to the line. If you do 2 of these jobs at $200, as long as it doesn't cross the $500 threshold, I treat it as cumulative, just so that there are no questions. If you don't like that, and I don't know the business itself, you could always talk to your fellow counselors and see if they would pass a resolution, like I had on one of the slides, concerning a sealed bid, and see if your jurisdiction would do its sealed bid to see if you win.
So the business is the town holds several events throughout the year. I own an entertainment company, so we provide sound system, MC, music for those events: Memorial Day, Veterans Day, Grand Illumination, things like that.
Yeah. Okay.
So those events generally aren't bidded out. So what you're saying, if they want to continue doing business with me, they'd have to group it together.
I think
do
a sealed bid. Yeah.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Hi. What about gifts for teachers? Like, if you're a teacher in your constituency, is there a cap on it? A lot of them are often monetary. I don't think a lot of my parents even know that I'm on town council, so I don't think that's what it is.
Can somebody pull up the presentation again? Okay, we can go to the next question, but I'll come back to that because there's actually, in that slide about the exception swallowing the rule, there's a, yes.
If your town is less than 2,500 people, what are the exceptions to the gift totals or filing of forms?
That's a good question. I can certainly ask.
Because I know I did not have to file
Yeah,
anything.
the statement of economic interest, I believe there is an exception. But as to gifts, I don't believe there is an exception
Okay,
in terms of what you can take.
okay, it's just I don't have to
It's
file.
the statement, I believe, is your, yeah. So, I want to thank Ms. Gowdy. As far as the teacher question, there is a specific part of the Conflict of Interest Act, and any gift related to the private profession or occupation or volunteer service of an officer or employee, that's one. There is also I don't know if you're talking about a plaque, trophy, wall memento, or similar item. Christmas gift, I think, again, that relates to your private profession or occupation. I don't know the size of the gifts themselves, but nobody. And actually, let me take a look while we're here. On the spot, there is another exception in here. Let's see. There is an exception for something.
And John, while you're
I'm sorry. That relates to scholarships in schools, but I think it would relate to your profession as a teacher.
I mean, it would be like
Yeah.
a $25 gift card
Sure.
to a bakery or something. You know,
Sure.
nothing.
We've got time for one more question. I'm going to go online for it, and if we sneak one more in the room, we will. Josette.
All right, the question is, what if a council member serves on a nonprofit, but the council contributes to the nonprofit within their yearly budget? Example, Main Street.
Again, I think the question is there a personal interest in the transaction itself is where you would go. Do you have a personal interest simply because you serve on a nonprofit board and the nonprofit receives funding from the council? It's, do you have a personal interest? And I'd also point, one of the slides talked about, there is the exception for nonprofit boards. For at least related to transactions.
Well, let's give John one last round of applause. We appreciate it very much. Thank you very much for being here, John. So we are nearly there, and so I get to close out with a couple of quick reminders. First off, thank you all for being here today, for attending and for attending online. We appreciate it. This is what VML is about, sharing information and learning from each other. The fact that you've got your FOIA and COIA information and your attendance slips turned in, that's really important for there. Remember to go visit your city attorney for FOIA with that very nice book as you rock and roll and moving forward. I want to also remind everybody that there are really important actions coming up for the General Assembly. As you heard multiple times up there, making sure the General Assembly pays attention to localities where we have to do the things that they change on us all the time and jump through the 17,000 hoops. I mean, their wisdom that they share with us from Richmond, it's important to pay attention to those things. So you're going to get information about the legislative bulletin coming out from VML. So really make sure that you've got access to that information. You can see it, sign up for legislative alerts, because we are going to ask you to respond quickly to information, to contact your elected officials. Preventing things from going forward is a lot of what many municipal leagues do, and our team here is fantastic at that. And with that, please, let's give a round of applause to our staff here. We have a great staff at VML. Thank you for putting this all together. We're going to close the broadcast here in 1 second for those of you there, just reminding everybody that Local Government Day is in Richmond, January 19th at the Omni Hotel. We hope to see you all there in person. And with that, we're going to go ahead and end the broadcast online right now. Thank you all for attending here. We appreciate you very much.